There's a difference between a prison and a tomb. One is designed for containment, the other is designed for death. But sometimes a government builds something that's both. A place where people are sent not to serve time, but to disappear. Where the sentence isn't years, it's erasure. Where escape isn't difficult, it's physically impossible. These places existed. Some still do, and the stories of what happened inside them are worse than most people imagine. If you're into dark history that doesn't make it into documentaries, subscribe to our Disturbed Historian for more. We're digging into the places historians would rather forget. Let's start with a prison everyone thinks they know. The Bastille, that fortress in Paris that revolutionaries stormed in 1789, liberating hundreds of suffering prisoners from the king's tyranny. The symbol of oppression finally destroyed by the people. It's a beautiful story. It's also mostly wrong. When the mob broke into the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, they found 7 prisoners. Not hundreds, 7. 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat who'd been locked up at his family's request. The great symbol of royal tyranny was basically empty. The revolutionary propaganda made it sound like they'd liberated thousands. The reality was closer to cleaning out a boarding house. But here's the thing. The Bastille's reputation wasn't entirely unearned. It just came from a different era. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Bastille was where the French monarchy disappeared people it couldn't execute. Political enemies, satirists, Protestants, anyone who made the king uncomfortable. The charge didn't matter. If the king signed a lettre de cachet, a sealed letter ordering imprisonment, you went to the Bastille. No trial, no defense, just a signature and you vanished. The conditions weren't uniformly horrific. That's what made it psychologically worse. If you were wealthy or well-connected, you could buy privileges. A furnished room, books, wine, visitors, some prisoners, lived almost comfortably, which created this perverse situation where your suffering depended entirely on whether you had money and who you knew. Poor prisoners got cells in the lower levels, stone rooms with no heat, minimal food, isolation that stretched for years. The real torture was uncertainty. Prisoners had no idea how long they'd be there. No sentence, no release date, just indefinite detention at the king's pleasure. Some stayed for months, some for decades. The man in the iron mask, possibly the most famous Bastille prisoner, was held for 34 years. His identity remains disputed, his crime unknown. He died in prison, his face reportedly hidden behind a velvet mask, his name erased from history. That uncertainty, that sense of being forgotten by the world outside, broke people more effectively than any physical torture. The Bastille's other weapon was silence. It sat in the middle of Paris, but what happened inside stayed inside. Guards were forbidden from discussing prisoners. Families weren't notified of arrests. People simply disappeared. Their friends would ask questions and receive no answers. Eventually, everyone stopped asking. The Bastille became a black hole where people fell and never came back. By 1789, the Bastille was outdated. The monarchy had newer, more efficient ways to deal with enemies, but its reputation lingered. So when revolutionaries needed a symbol to attack, they chose the Bastille. They tore it apart stone by stone. They turned the destruction into a spectacle. They pretended they'd freed hundreds because the truth, 7 confused prisoners blinking in the sunlight, wasn't dramatic enough. The Bastille was demolished so thoroughly that almost nothing remains. There's a column in the square now. Tourists walk over the outline of the foundation without realizing it. The prison that symbolized tyranny exists now only as an idea, but the people who died there, The ones who went mad in solitary cells waiting for release that never came. They were real. Their suffering wasn't symbolic. If you want a prison with longevity, though, you need the Tower of London. The Tower has stood since 1066, nearly 1,000 years of continuous use as a fortress, a palace, an armory, a treasury, and most famously, a prison. It's still there, still imposing, still surrounded by walls built to withstand siege engines. Tourists visit now. They see the crown jewels and take photos with the beef eaters. What they don't see is the 1,000 years of suffering that's soaked into those stones. The tower wasn't designed as a prison. It was built by William the Conqueror to intimidate London, to show the conquered English exactly who held power now. But powerful structures inevitably become prisons, because powerful people always need somewhere to put their enemies. And the tower was perfect for high-value prisoners, nobles, bishops, foreign royalty. People too important to throw in a common jail, but too dangerous to leave free. The first prisoner arrived in 1100, Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, accused of extortion and corruption. He escaped by getting his guards, drunk and climbing down a rope, smuggled in a wine barrel. He was the only person to successfully escape. The tower for over 800 years. Everyone else either died inside or left, only when their captors decided to release them, which usually meant leading them to an executioner. The tower's most famous prisoners died there. Anne Boleyn, beheaded on the Tower Green in 1536 after Henry VIII tired of her. Catherine Howard, also beheaded 2 wives later. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, executed at 17 for a throne she never wanted. Thomas More, who refused to recognize Henry as head of the church and died for his principles. The list goes on. Hundreds of names, most forgotten. A few remembered because their deaths were dramatic enough to make history. But execution was the quick option. Some prisoners stayed for years, decades even. Walter Raleigh spent 13 years in the Tower before his eventual execution. He had a relatively comfortable imprisonment. 2 rooms in the bloody Tower. His wife lived with him for a while. He wrote books, conducted scientific experiments, walked in the gardens under guard. But comfort doesn't erase captivity. He knew every day that he was alive only because the king hadn't ordered otherwise. That knowledge ate at him. You can read it in his letters. The slow erosion of hope. Lower status prisoners had it worse. The dungeons beneath the White Tower were windowless pits carved into foundation stone. Cold, damp, dark prisoners were lowered in and forgotten. Some were interrogated, which is a gentle word for what actually happened. Torture was technically illegal in England, but the Tower operated under different rules. Rack scavengers, daughter, manacles, the little ease, a cell so small you couldn't stand or lie down, just exist in permanent discomfort until your joints swelled and your mind broke. Guy Fawkes was interrogated in the Tower after the gunpowder plot. His signature before interrogation was clear and steady. His signature after is barely a scrawl. They broke him physically and extracted the confession they wanted. Then they executed him anyway, because the torture was never about information. It was about demonstrating power. The Tower had a particular genius for psychological torment. Prisoners could see London through barred windows, could hear the city, could smell the Thames. Freedom was visible but untouchable. That proximity to normal life while being cut off from it drove people mad. Some prisoners carved messages into cell walls, names, dates, prayers. The walls are covered with these carvings. Desperate attempts to prove they'd existed, to leave something behind. The last execution at the Tower was in 1941. Joseph Jacobs, a German spy shot by firing squad. The tower stopped being a prison after that, though it briefly held Rudolf Hess and the Kray twins. Now it's a museum, a tourist attraction. The crown jewels draw massive crowds. People queue for hours to see shiny objects. While walking past the execution, sight without a second glance, but the tower's ghosts are famous. People report seeing Anne Boleyn walking the grounds, her head tucked under her arm. Others see the princes in the tower, the two boys who disappeared in 1483 and were likely murdered by their uncle, Richard III. Skeptics dismiss these sightings, but spend a night in the tower, in the actual fortress, not the tourist areas, and you'll understand why people see things. The weight of all that death lingers. Buildings remember. The Ottomans, meanwhile, had a different approach to imprisonment. They didn't need elaborate fortresses. They had something simpler and far more terrifying: the Yedikule fortress and the dungeons beneath Topkapi Palace. Yedikule, the fortress of the Seven Towers, sat at the edge of Constantinople. It was originally part of the old Byzantine walls, but the Ottomans repurposed it. They added a prison, called it the Fortress of Blood. The name wasn't metaphorical. Ottoman dungeons weren't designed for long-term imprisonment. The Ottoman justice system didn't do prison sentences the way European systems did. You were either fined, mutilated, exiled, or executed. Prison was temporary, a holding cell before judgment. But temporary in an Ottoman dungeon could still mean death. The wells were the worst part. Not wells for water, wells for people. Deep stone pits accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down. The hole was covered. Food and water came irregularly. Light never came. You sat in darkness at the bottom of a stone shaft, listening to rats and your own breathing, waiting for a decision from above that might never come. Some prisoners stayed in the wells for weeks, some for months, some until they died and their bodies rotted at the bottom. When a new prisoner needed the space, workers would lower a hook and drag out whatever remained of the previous occupant. The Ottomans were practical about disposal. Ambassadors and foreign dignitaries who fell out of favor ended up in Yedikule. The empire would arrest them on espionage charges, real or invented, throw them in the dungeons, use them as leverage in negotiations. Sometimes it worked. The ambassador's government would pay a ransom or make concessions. Sometimes it didn't. The ambassador died in the well, and international relations moved on. The fortress also served as an execution site. The Gate of Blood at Yedikule was where high-ranking prisoners met their end. Grand viziers who'd failed the sultan, governors accused of corruption, military commanders who'd lost battles. They were brought to Yedikule, given a few hours to prepare, then strangled with the silk bowstring. Their bodies were displayed as warnings, but the Ottomans saved their cruelest exile for a different purpose entirely: the cage. The cage wasn't a dungeon. It was an apartment, a series of rooms in Topkapi Palace where Ottoman princes were confined for their entire lives. Starting in the early 1600s, instead of executing rival princes, sultans locked them away, kept them alive but isolated, controlled, harmless. Princes in the cage had servants, food, books, concubines. Though any children born to those concubines were immediately killed to prevent rival bloodlines. The princes could walk in small courtyards. They had windows overlooking the Bosphorus. From the outside, it looked almost pleasant. From the inside, it was a lifetime of psychological destruction. These princes knew they'd never leave except to become sultan, which meant their only path to freedom was their brother's death. And if they did become sultan, they had no experience, no education in governance, no understanding of the world outside their gilded prison. They'd spent decades in isolation and were suddenly expected to rule an empire. Most went mad. Some were paranoid. Some were incompetent. A few were surprisingly capable despite everything. But all of them were damaged by the cage in ways that shaped the empire's decline. The cage produced sultans who executed thousands out of paranoia. Sultans who ignored governance entirely. Sultans who trusted no one because they'd learned in the cage that everyone was a potential threat. The institution designed to prevent civil war created a different kind of catastrophe, a succession of broken rulers governing a fracturing empire. The practice continued until the empire's end. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, had spent years in the cage. By the time he took power in 1918, the empire was collapsing. Whether he could have stopped it is debatable. But the cage certainly didn't prepare him to try. If the Ottomans mastered psychological imprisonment, the Russians perfected geographical impossibility. Siberian exile wasn't a single prison. It was a concept. Take political prisoners, criminals, dissidents, anyone inconvenient, and ship them thousands of miles east to the coldest, most inhospitable regions of the Russian Empire. No walls needed. The climate and distance were the prison. Exile to Siberia started under the Tsars in the 17th century and continued under the Soviets. The journey alone killed significant numbers. Prisoners walked in chains for months, thousands of miles across steppe and forest. No adequate food, no medical care. Guards drove them forward. Those who couldn't keep up were left behind. In winter they froze. In summer they starved. The survivors reached Siberian settlements that barely qualified as settlements. Wooden shacks in endless wilderness, temperatures dropping to -50 in winter. Work in mines or lumber camps or construction projects. The work was brutal, but it wasn't the main punishment. The isolation was, you were thousands of miles from home. No communication with family. No news from the outside world. Just cold and work, and other exiles who were as broken and desperate as you. Escape was theoretically possible. You could walk away. But walk where? The nearest civilization was weeks away on foot. You had no supplies. No food, no maps. The taiga stretched in every direction. Most escapees died of exposure within days. Their bodies weren't found until spring thaw. Some made it further. A handful even reached the border and crossed into Mongolia or China. But those cases were rare enough to be legendary. The vast majority either died in exile or served their sentence and were released, but forbidden from returning to European Russia. You were free but still trapped in Siberia, still isolated, still disappeared. The Soviets industrialized the process. The Gulag system turned Siberian exile into a massive forced labor operation. Millions sent to camps, millions dead from exposure, starvation, exhaustion. The geography did most of the killing. Guards barely needed weapons. Where were you going to run? One of the most notorious camps was Kolyma, in the far northeast. Winter temperatures reached -60. Prisoners worked in gold mines and construction with inadequate clothing and minimal food. Survival rates were abysmal. Former prisoners called it the planet of ice. Some said it was worse than the Nazi camps because at least those ended relatively quickly. Kolyma just ground you down year after year until you stopped being human and became a frozen corpse in a mass grave. The camps officially closed after Stalin died. The word officially is doing heavy lifting there. Forced labor camps existed in various forms through the Soviet period. Modern Russia still uses penal colonies in remote regions. The names change, the locations shift, but the concept remains. Disappear people by putting them somewhere so far from civilization that they might as well not exist. But if you want the historical foundation for all of this, if you want to see where institutional imprisonment began, you need ancient Rome. The Romans didn't really do prisons as punishment. Prison was pre-trial detention. You were held until your trial, then executed, exiled, enslaved, or released. Long-term imprisonment wasn't a concept. It was inefficient. Why feed and house criminals when you could just kill them or put them to work? But they did have holding facilities, and some of those facilities were designed specifically to break prisoners before execution. The Tullianum, also called the Mamertine prison, was built around 600 BCE. It's still there. Beneath a church in Rome, tourists can visit. It's tiny. 2 small chambers carved into bedrock beneath the Roman Forum. The upper chamber was accessible by stairs. The lower chamber, the Tullianum proper, was accessed only through a hole in the floor. Prisoners were lowered into darkness. The Tullianum was reserved for enemies of Rome, captured foreign kings, rebel leaders, political threats. They were held in the lower chamber until the Senate decided their fate, which was usually execution. The prisoners sat in complete darkness. No light, no space to stand. Just stone and the weight of knowing that Rome had defeated you and would soon kill you. Several famous prisoners died in the Tullianum. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who fought Julius Caesar, was held there for years before being executed. Jugurtha, the Numidian king, was starved to death in the dungeon. The Catiline conspirators were strangled there. The pattern was consistent: capture, display in a triumphal parade, imprisonment in the Tullianum, then execution. The prison was part of the humiliation, a final demonstration that Rome had total power over you. The lower chamber was deliberately claustrophobic. The ceiling was low, the walls close. Prisoners couldn't escape the feeling of being buried alive. Some ancient sources claim there was a spring in the chamber that St. Peter miraculously created to baptize his fellow prisoners before execution. There is water seepage in the chamber, though it's less miraculous and more geological. The spring legend probably arose to explain the constant dampness and the fact that prisoners didn't die of thirst before their executions. But Rome's real innovation wasn't a specific prison. It was the concept of damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines. Criminals, particularly Christians during persecutions, were sent to imperial mines, silver mines, gold mines, quarries. These weren't prisons with walls. They were work sites in remote locations where prisoners were literally worked to death. The sentence was life, but life didn't last long. Conditions in Roman mines were appalling, even by ancient standards. Prisoners worked in narrow tunnels with minimal ventilation. Collapses were common. Injuries frequent. Medical care non-existent. Food was whatever kept you alive long enough to keep working. Sleep was a few hours on stone floors. The darkness was total. Prisoners worked by lamplight, but lamps required oil, and oil was expensive. Most work happened in near-complete darkness. You felt your way through tunnels, chipped at rock faces you couldn't see, hauled baskets of ore toward a distant glimmer that marked the exit you'd never be allowed to take. Escape was unlikely but not impossible. The mines were remote, but they weren't sealed fortresses. Some prisoners ran. Very few made it. Most were recaptured and punished. The punishment for escape. Attempt was often mutilation, hamstringing, blinding. Size, anything that ensured you could still work but couldn't run, Rome was practical about these things. Some mines had mortality rates approaching 100% within a year. The Spanish silver mines were particularly deadly. The heat, the dust, the constant physical strain. Prisoners didn't last. They were replaced by new prisoners. The cycle continued for centuries. The practice ended officially when Christianity became Rome's state religion. Christians didn't love the irony of using the same mines that had killed their martyrs to punish new criminals. But forced labor in mines continued under different names in different empires. The Roman model was simply too effective. Why execute criminals quickly when you could extract years of work from them first? What unites all these prisons, from the Bastille to Siberia to the Tullianum, is a specific philosophy. The point wasn't rehabilitation. It wasn't justice. It was removal. These places existed to make people disappear, to extract them from society and ensure they never returned. Some prisons did it through physical barriers, walls, guards, islands, geography. Some did it through isolation, distance, silence, bureaucratic erasure. Some did it through psychological destruction. The cage, the wells, the uncertainty of never knowing if you'd be released or killed. But all of them shared the same basic function. You went in and you didn't come out, not as the person you were. The cruelty wasn't incidental. It was fundamental. These institutions were designed to break people, to demonstrate state power, to warn anyone watching what happened when you opposed the system. The suffering was the point. Whether it was a French noble rotting in the Bastille, or a Roman slave dying in a mine, or an Ottoman prince going mad in the cage, the message was identical. The state can do this to you and no one will stop it. And the truly haunting part is how normal this all was. These weren't aberrations. They were standard practice. Multiple civilizations across thousands of years all independently arrived at the same conclusion. The best way to deal with enemies is to bury them, somewhere no one will find them, and let time do the rest. The Bastille is gone. The Tullianum is a tourist site. The Tower of London sells tickets. Yedikula is a museum. Siberia is still Siberia, but the camps are officially closed. These places exist now as history, as stories, as warnings we tell ourselves we've learned from. But the impulse that created them hasn't disappeared. The desire to remove undesirable people, to make them vanish, to build systems that ensure certain people never escape. That impulse is human. It's consistent. It shows up in every culture that accumulates enough power to act on it. These prisons were built by people, operated by people. Normal people with families and jobs and lives outside the fortress walls. They went to work, locked prisoners in wells, went home to dinner and slept fine. The capacity for institutional cruelty doesn't require monsters. It just requires institutions and people willing to follow procedures. That's what makes these places so disturbing. Not the stone walls or the iron bars or the geographical remoteness, but the human systems that created them. The signatures on orders, the guards who showed up for shifts, the bureaucrats who processed paperwork, the entire apparatus of normal people participating in extraordinary cruelty because it was their job. The prisons are empty now, but the blueprints still exist.